I'm Alex James, and I'm a relationship manager in the London Theatre team, which basically means that I work with the organisations that we fund over a longer period. So I have a bunch of those that I work with. Arts Depot is one of those, although it's not one that I work with. And I also work on the other programmes that we run and have a particular focus on National Lottery project grants, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot about. And in that capacity, it's looking at how the programme's running, but also doing this kind of thing where me and a bunch of colleagues try and come up with ways of supporting people to access the fund or get some guidance or just have conversations about projects where we have the capacity to do that. And then I sit on the decision-making panels on a rota with a bunch of colleagues as well and chair those panels. So in a kind of nutshell, I guess that's my relationship to funding, and then I've done bits and bobs, not as an Arts Council person, as a producer and an artist, though not as much of that as I would have liked over the last decade or so.
Hi, I'm Vikesh from Jokeline Theatre, and basically my relationship to funding is that I'm the co-artistic director of Jokeline, and we apply for project grants. So we run our organisation project to project, and we kind of see what the needs of that project are and what the engagement activity around those projects are, and kind of write the application and go for project to project. And we've been quite successful over the last few years, even though I'm yet to crack the new application form. So I hope we hear a little bit about that today.
I do disservice as well, Vikesh. Vikesh is Chalkline, for those of you that don't know, I'm getting nods, are alumni from our Artist Resident programme, which some of you guys are on at the moment, which is great. Sorry, Tim.
Hello. So I started out as a producer about 22 years ago, and then worked for Chicken Shed Theatre Company as a fundraiser for a few years across the sort of trusts and individuals and events side of things, and went to be a business advisor for the National Theatre for a couple of years. But really a really good learning curve for me was 6 years at Battersea Arts Centre, where I kind of built a fundraising team and led a capital campaign, and worked across the different mix of fundraising styles and approaches and options. Been here for roughly 10 years, led a little patch of fundraising for Sadler's Wells at one point. So yeah, I've got quite a breadth of experience with funders, from the very high net worth through to very community engagement side of things.
Thank you, thanks guys. Hi guys that just turned up. We've literally just started, you haven't mistaken. Feel free to come and go as you please. And we're going to chat for a bit and then we'll do questions halfway through if you have any. The new form was mentioned, it came up already, and that feels like an appropriate place to start, if that's all right, Alex. So for some of us in the room would have noticed that the form changed in the last year, but nicely we are a year removed. And when we were chatting, we were talking about maybe not focusing too much on what was, but focusing on the change that we've had. So what are some of the key elements for artists to consider now that you've noticed the change in the form and what you've got through?
I mean, I think there's a couple of kind of fundamental changes to the programme. The form itself has changed quite a bit, but mainly only in terms of, I guess the layout and the structure of it has changed a little bit. But actually, most of the content or the detail that we ask for is pretty much the same as last time. One of the big changes that we made was, of course, to change the lower threshold of grant from 15,000 to 30,000, so that we could, turn around decisions more quickly on those more expensive and ambitious projects. But the biggest change, I think, the one that from feedback we're hearing is is creating, I guess, the biggest challenge for applicants is that it's now so closely linked to our 10-year strategy, which wasn't a sort of prerequisite before. You didn't have to argue against how you were contributing to the strategy in the same way. So for those of you that don't know, the new strategy has these 3 outcomes. Within those outcomes there's a bunch of elements, and it also has 4 investment principles, and we ask every applicant to know how their project contributes to those. Although, again, without getting into too much detail, there's obviously different levels of funding, and that requires different expectations in terms of the detail, in terms of which outcomes and investment principles you might articulate a contribution to. So the biggest onus I think that we've put onto applicants is that we basically now expect that you've read the strategy, or at least digested some parts of the strategy, such that you can then articulate how what you're doing contributes to it. Lots of what I'm going to say is A, open to dispute, B, open to discussion. It kind of goes without saying that I'm not here to say that the programme is perfect, the guidance is perfect, etc. So, you know, we're a year in, and we're now starting to reflect on some of the feedback that we've had and whether or not the way we envisaged it working is actually working. So that's one of the big, and then within that there's a kind of, I guess, a structural challenge that we've heard a lot as well, which is that applicants don't have the same amount of space just to articulate what their project is as they used to. That's been streamlined quite a lot. So if you're the kind of applicant that really likes to talk about the synopsis of your project, talk about the scale, etc., where you put that information is now, I think, it's broken up into more sections. So just you know, what feels like a minor change actually is seemingly having quite a big impact on how applicants feel they're able to tell us what it is they want to do. Stop me if I'm going on, because really as I say, we could go on for a long time. So what to do about that? So there's 1,100 characters at the start under your project. As I said a minute ago, we're still asking for the same sort of thing, and the way that I always used to say it is that that's your what's the word in film pitching, like that's where you put your 3 or 4 sentence synopsis in, and then you talk about the scale and a little bit about the content, a bit about the form. So for example, you might say that it's a dance theatre piece for studios, and you want to reach this particular kind of audience. Like that's the bare bones of what it is you want to do. And you then spend the rest of the form putting in detail that makes that feel viable and fleshes it out a little bit. It's not got the same amount of space to go into sort of great detail about every facet of the project, so it needs to feel kind of punchy, and you need to do it in kind of bullet point form, I think, if you've got quite a complex project. Again, it's difficult because, like, what would be useful is to go through each section of the application form, and I could kind of say, well, here's some things that you should probably do here, and here's some things that I wouldn't do. So this maybe feels a bit abstract, but yeah, the big difference is really understanding what those outcomes and investment principles are, and not overstretching in those sections so that you feel you've got to fill in every single box with lots and lots of detail. Like, boil your project down as much as you can and get to know the elements within the outcomes, for example, because that's what will tell you how your project relates to that contribution to the strategy. So I'm rambling now, sorry.
No, and actually that format of looking through the form bit by bit as well is something that this isn't the format for that, so it's good to have a summary of it, and of course if people have specifics to go in on that's really helpful, but it's just good to touch on it for now. So
okay.
That's really helpful, thank you. So Vikesh, at risk of embarrassing you, you have had a few successful applications along the way, so I would be naive to assume that doesn't come with pitfalls along the way. If you could go back and give advice for those of us here who this is our first time as well, approaching applications, or maybe we've had a couple of rejections, what advice would you have wanted to hear at that time, or is there any obvious pitfalls that you wish you'd have known about without experiencing them?
Yeah, I think give yourself the time to fail is very important. So in terms of like what we like to do is we apply, and then if we don't get the money, then we can reapply. While if your project's really time sensitive and it's all going to flames if you don't get this one application, then yeah, like that's something that I used to do, and now I try and give myself as much time as I can. So that's one of the things. And another thing is pay yourselves and make sure you put the producer fees in there, fees for yourself. The in-kind support, let it not you be doing a million jobs on your own. So I think that's like really, really important, and I think Arts Council, correct me if I'm wrong, also appreciate the fact that there's kind of, it's a realistic team making the scale of this show. So I think that's really, really important as well. There used to be a lot of like conversations in the beginning when we first started the company, when we were like, oh, let's put up our in-kind support, let's try and like, do this for free and do this for free, and then you end up getting the money and you end up paying everyone but yourself for all the work, and it's like, highly not recommended, especially after you kind of put in all the work in writing that application. So I think, yeah, those are kind of my 2 bits of advice, I would say.
That's great. No,
Yeah.
Thank you. And Tim, we're talking, so far we're only talking about Arts Council. Are there, and when I started, I knew nothing about any other ways to get funding, and I found that's still the case as well. There's not as much info out there, but it is out there. So it would be great if you could touch on some alternative funding to Arts Council that we should be on our radars.
Yeah, definitely. I'll start by saying I've written quite a lot of notes, which you're going to be emailed, and included in that is like a list of about 30 funders that might be worth considering. Now, I mean, the main thing about other sorts of funding is it's finding something that is right and relevant for you, because not all sorts of funding are going to be right and relevant for you, and some are easier to access, and you could also spend a lot of time trying to chase sources of income that are not really going to potentially work for you. So I think something to think about is where your work exists on the terrain of sort of high art that is defined by art and socially driven. I'm not saying those 2 things don't completely come together at times, but it is a lot easier, I would argue, to find funding for projects that are socially motivated. I was commissioned to do some work a few years ago, looking into theatre companies. One quite well-known theatre company had lost their NPO funded status, so I was approached by a theatre impresario to say, look, she was on the board. She was like, we've got to be able to work out how to fund this organisation going forward. So I researched a lot of theatre companies and their different income models, and what became really clear and obvious is that all those that have a social agenda forefront were accessing a lot of funding from trusts, foundations, individual philanthropists. They've typically gone down the route of establishing charities. So if you're thinking of Chicken Shed Theatre, like Belarus Free Theatre, I did write a little list. You know the ones. You know the kind. Like if your main sort of focus is profiling homelessness, cardboard citizens, or clean break theatre, these organisations are all generating hundreds of thousands of pounds every year from grants, which you don't have to be a charity to get a grant, but the vast majority of grant-making entities are going to prefer a charity, which a lot of you, it's not going to be a relevant or appropriate model for you. for some of you, if your work is very much in that terrain, it might be something to consider, but there's a lot of admin, a lot of kind of steps before you get there. So there's different trading models, and the type of fundraising that you do will determine the type of kind of model, from the freelancer, just sort of going out there making work, through to the I want trustees and I want a board. I could go on for a long time, so you might just shut me up at some point. There is another question later which goes into some of this. I'm sure some of you before would have tried a Kickstarter or that kind of fundraising appeal. If you are a sort of freelance artist or a small collective of artists, this is a great way of kind of reaching out to the networks you have, building often some smaller sums of money, but I've seen, so there was an appeal, I don't know if you've heard of Petetra Theatre. They did a Kickstarter a few years ago, and I was really astonished to see that we'd just done one that had been terribly unsuccessful at Arts Depot. We were raising money for some puppets for a show called Bigo, which I thought would be an easy win, and about 8 people supported that campaign. And then I watched Petetra do an appeal and raise £22,000 from 800 people, and they were a much, much significantly smaller entity than us. But when you look at what that project was for, they were developing a show in Great Ormond Street Hospital with children and young people who were sort of, their life end was not that far away. So you kind of go, okay, when they reached out to people were like, oh my God, this is an incredible project, I have to get behind it. So it's about the narratives that you have, the agencies that you're working with, and sadly there is also a socio-economic impact or thing as well, where if you're going down that route of sort of platform fundraising, either you're fortunate and you've come from a world where you know people that have got deep pockets, or you've found some people that come from the world where people have deep pockets, to help spread that word and reach out there. Because you can do a lot of work and get very little out of it, or you can do a little bit of work and get a lot out of it, and a lot of that will depend on who you know and how hard you work those connections. It doesn't mean that if you don't know those people, you can't find them. It's just a consideration. I'll probably stop there.
No, that's great, and I will email out your notes, and we will talk about hunting down rich people later.
Yeah, we've got that on the
Because I
list.
did want to learn how to do it.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. So, Alex, on the new form post-COVID, there is opportunities to talk about specifically your online audience, and I was just wondering how much, if at all, this is a factor for ACE when considering projects to fund. For example, if I have a project that doesn't have any plans to engage with anybody online, I'm just thinking about a live audience. Should I be thinking, how can I get this out there for an online audience as well, or is that something you don't want people to think about?
No, I mean, I think as with almost all the questions on the form, it depends what your project is, and it's not a leading question to include online audiences. I think there's a couple of things. One is that we're interested in if your project has a digital or an online element, what the reach will be and how that's been calculated. That could be that you're marketing it using social media and that you've estimated how many people you'll reach through a campaign. It could be that you're going to live stream a show one night and that you think you're going to be able to reach people on a certain platform doing that. The important thing with that is just using sensible calculations that are based on something, because what we definitely do see a lot of the time, because for example YouTube has a limitless audience, people will put 2 million online audience because that could happen, but it's not been calculated or estimated in any way that suggests that's realistic. So even if you're only going to reach 10 people online, like if you've worked that out and you think that that's got a public engagement benefit to what you're doing, then that's great, and that you should just tell us that that's the case. I think the other thing maybe that is sort of worth considering and is possibly a bit of a hangover from COVID is the you know, there's still live risk of physical events having to close. I know it feels remote at the moment, and that's something that you could consider in the risks for your project, and as a possible contingency. There might be things that you can move online. We all obviously are familiar with how rehearsals and other projects moved onto Zoom or, you know, into a digital space. So they're the two things that I would consider, but I would never, ever, ever say that just because we have a little section on the form that asks you to put your digital or your broadcast audience in, that we then expect every project to include an element of that.
Great, really reassuring as well, thank you. Vikesh, we talked about pitfalls, and I was wondering if it was possible to touch on any mechanisms of support, considering how competitive it is, Arts Council funding, and especially for all of us who happen to be in London as well, it's even harder. Is there any mechanisms of support for artists writing applications that you didn't know about? Any ways to strengthen form applications that maybe you didn't know about as well?
I think it's really important to always know that people in art organizations and venues that you know are often really willing to have a coffee with you. So, like, always, just the people you know who've written on an Arts Council application before and have been successful, just give them a call, be like, let's meet for a coffee, can we like chat about this? And they'll give you advice on that, for example. So I found that to be really helpful. I worked on the Welcome team at Battersea Arts Centre as well. And over there, one of the opportunities we had was to like shadow people. And some people on the Welcome team didn't take that opportunity, but I literally like shadowed every single person I could and learned as much as I could from everyone over there. And yeah, so it's really important to find your people and find the people who've been doing it for longer than you, because they were once in your position, and they found people who helped them. Like everybody I know has like sent Arts Council applications to friends, to people who work in venues to read. So I think that's really, really important. Also, outside of Arts Council, if you're looking to make kind of more commercial theatre, for example, I found a real amazing home in Stage 1 as well. So I did the Stage 1 workshop over 3 days where I learned about commercial producing, and I also am bursary recipient from there, and like they gave me some office space and things like that. So that's a really, really good resource if you want to go in a different kind of direction. And also, I think always keep an eye on kind of opportunities for artists and low-risk opportunities as well. So like the residency here was amazing opportunity to just like try stuff out. And I think it came with a little bit of financial support as well. New Diorama at the moment did something incredible, which for me is like fantastic. It's closed now, but like hopefully they have more of that kind of stuff in the future, where they were giving out funding for R&Ds, but actual R&Ds, not the definition of what R&Ds are mostly in this country, but actually like you have no pressure to deliver anything, just go and play and try. So those kind of opportunities, when they're out there, like really, like keep an eye on them. I use a blog, a website called of Arts Admin, called their Anchor newsletter. So on that newsletter, you have like lists of residencies and those kind of opportunities. So that's a really, really good resource. And also like look outside of the UK as well. Like there's so many residencies and R&Ds like outside the UK as well, which like I just applied to one in Norway that has do with puppetry and stuff. So like literally like just look out for these opportunities constantly and speak to people who've been in the industry for longer than you have, and they can really like point you in the right direction and help you out.
That's great, thank you. You've opened yourself up to 50 of us Facebooking you to try and get a successful application for your coffee as well. Tim, we mentioned rich people. How to hunt them down, how to... Well, no, because genuinely, because when I was first starting, I heard a lot about, find a rich person, ask them to fund your project. I thought it was a joke. But it is a legitimate funding stream for a lot of successful companies. But for those of us that don't have those connections, how do you identify and how do you pitch and approach these people?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? So, things I've written in my notes are around sort of care of people. Like, if you're going to engage people, you need to find these people, you need to stay in touch with them. So, send newsletters, send little notes, invite them to things. And there's also like a big feature, I think, of what I've seen in my career in this terrain is the sort of the lunch that pays out forever. You know, sometimes you buy someone a lunch and you're going to see that lunch come back 10,000 times. But it's about having a spirit of generosity and care. And we all probably see this slightly in our personal lives. Sometimes the worst, you really don't want to kind of, how to express that. I'll tell you a little story. A woman called Carol Lake, who led on philanthropy for JP Morgan, I once bumped into. She was a trustee at BAC at a drag night in Wilton's Music Hall, which she'd gone by herself. I'm not quite certain what that was her interest there. I was there with my partner, who I massively ditched. Okay, I'm on Carol Lake tonight. Partly that was because I really like Carol Lake, but also she was one by herself, and we'd actually come with a couple of other friends. I thought he'd be okay. The next day, she pinged me an email, just like, "Oh, thanks Tim for hanging out. That was really fun. If there's anything I can do for you, let me know." Oh yeah, Carol, I got some things you can do for me. So Carol became the chair of the first development council that we formed at BAC, and like most people I found over the years that tell you that there's nothing they can do, they're not sure if they can help. It wasn't long before she secured £140,000 for a 3-year funding agreement. I always think sometimes when a rich person raises their arms and says they haven't got any money, they know they're thinking about they might need to be giving you some money. That's the kind of one of the first moments with rich people when they're telling you they haven't got any money. Andrew Lloyd Webber told David Job, assistant director of BAC, I haven't got it. I can't give you any money. And stuff. The check mark in the post.
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's a complete lie. He's got loads of money.
Exactly. You can tell that this is what's running through his brain, and the check will arrive in the post the next week. That stuff, the thing about rich people is, yes, it can work, but just because someone's rich doesn't mean they're going to give you some money. There has to be a kind of a strong connection. There has to be a strong reason why they're going to do that.
Yeah, I just to add to what you're saying, I think for rich people who give out money, I think what they're always looking for is something that money can't buy. So if they can be involved, if they can come to rehearsal, if they can come to the press night and come to the after party and meet, the people who were behind this or whatever, they really like experiences that they can't buy because they can buy everything. So just keep that in mind, I would say.
No, totally agree with that.
Yeah.
So I would say understand you're a rich person, research them. If you're doing something in a certain terrain, and you read about someone who you think, oh my God, my story will really resonate with them. This is their shared story. This is their background. I'm going to touch a nerve here. I feel like there's a connection. And actually, probably you should be thinking if you're an individual artist, especially I need to know this person for more than their money. Then you might find that there's a spark there. There's something. Most sort of philanthropists, high net worth owners, are often working through organisations when they're supporting artists. Is probably a bit harder as an independent artist unless you happen to come from that world or have a great charm in that world. But where it can work is where there's that synergy, there's that sort of reason where you kind of go, I think they're going to buy into this, or I think I need them as part of my journey. And and it can take a bit of warming up. It can take a bit of sort of relationship building to get to that point. But and sometimes those relationships can take several years to sort of realise where that point in time comes, where you kind of go, this is when I need you now. This is where you help and where it makes a lot of sense. But keep those people brewing and keep people in touch. I think it's a really good idea as an artist to have a personal newsletter and not even to always know why you're doing it, but to sort of build your supporters, build your pool. These are your people, or people that are interested, that have handed you a card, and get some regularity behind it. Just maybe once a quarter, just go, this is where my work's at, this is where I'm going. Because sometimes it'll be a contact that could be 5, 10, even 15 years, and you kind of go, this is our moment, this is when I'm coming to their city, or I'm doing something which relates to something they once told me.
That's great. Thank you. Cheers, Tim. Yes?
Can I just say quick 3 things just that occurred to me while I was listening. One is that, like, a very simple thing to do, you're asking about support networks, is just ask people that you know that don't necessarily work in the arts to read your applications. I've done it when I've been applying for Arts Council. I've also done it when I've written a call out, say, for a programme that I've been working on, because there's so much kind of bullshit language that goes with what we do, that actually it's really useful to know when it's just straightforward and understood by someone who doesn't need to know the coded language. And a project application, although there might be bits of it that feel a bit bizarre if you're not reading lots of them, often if your project isn't straightforward, someone that reads that application will be able to, or the way you've articulated it rather isn't straightforward, someone will be able to tell you whether or not they work in the arts. The R&D point, one of the changes that we did make on the form is that you talk about activity type, I think is the way it's called, so it's whether it's a physical event that's static, physical event that's touring, an online event. One of them is that you're doing a project that will have public engagement in the future. So a big obstacle, I think, for lots of applicants in the previous version of project grants was that there was a sense that if you were doing R&D, you had to have a public engagement element wrapped in with it, even if you were just exploring your ideas at a very early stage. And obviously that's really difficult to be able to say who that audience might be, or to get a space where you're going to be engaging people in that way while you're still developing it. So the idea behind us including that is that we open it up to projects that are in an earlier phase of their creative development, and that there isn't the same obligation to have that public engagement element in the short term. Again, we're only a year into looking at the data to see how many people are putting something in that box, and therefore whether or not it's really making a difference, but just worth noting. And then very, very quickly, you can include skills development in your project grant activities, and that includes things like fundraising. If you want to learn from someone who's had lots of experience at this, if you want to go to a conference or an event that might support you in meeting people, you can include that as a strand of what you're doing. So again, maybe relates a bit more to DYCP if it was a standalone thing, but if you say we're going to enhance our production by our producer going to X, Y and Z workshop or seminar, that will help them develop their fundraising skills, and that will manifest in this way on this project, and that can often be a way of learning those skills and be a way of strengthening the project overall.
Amazing, that's great, thank you. Thank you for expanding. I've got more questions, but I want to prioritise your questions. So let's open it up. If you've got a specific question for somebody, or if you want to just throw it out, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of the costs we have, I guess, industry guidelines around them. Some of them we don't, and they're not always necessarily the precise figure you should use, but the Arts Council does consider, for example, equity, ITC, etc., as membership organisations setting their rates annually. They haven't actually done, well, a couple of them haven't done that this year because of COVID but the sort of established membership organisations, we would look at that as a starting point, if you like, for setting some of those fees around, for example, paying actors, paying playwrights, paying directors. There are then, of course, things like space hire and those kinds of costs that can fluctuate according to where you are. So we'd look at you to articulate where you'd pulled that figure from. And in fact, you know, everything to do with the budget, the more you can talk about how you've calculated that or estimated that, the better. And the less that we're likely to ask fewer questions about where that sum came from and whether or not it feels realistic. So there's no one standard way, but there are different different guidelines and different kind of, I guess, industry recognised rates and sums that you could point to.
So I come on the newsletter thing. I mean, I think newsletter was one suggestion, but I think they're not going to be right for everybody. Not everybody's a newsletter writer, might not have the right content at the right time. I think one thing you've got to consider is that you're all storytellers. That's what you do well, and that's what works in fundraising. It's storytelling and narratives, and whether that's keeping people in your loop, in your terrain, listening to you, and whether it's using devices like social media, whether it's doing newsletters, letters, notes, but one way or another, just think about how you tell your stories, keep telling stories, and if you're aiming some of those stories at engaging people and at fundraising, just imagine, just kind of put a bit of that thinking in when you're kind of sending those messages out there.
Just quickly as well to the point that Vikesh made just while we're talking about pay rates. This isn't like an official published line at all, so so do with it what you will. But obviously inflation is wild right now, and none of the published rates that I just talked about are factored in anywhere near like what inflation is at the moment. So as Vikesh rightly said, you should pay yourself properly on all the projects, pay yourself and your collaborators properly on all your projects. One of the reasons we raised it from 15 to 30k is to avoid people salami slicing fees, because you know it just creates a very unhealthy cycle, not just of people not being paid properly, but of nobody knowing what projects actually should cost.
And you also cut the percentage of match funding, right? So again, the expectation on having other cash match funding isn't quite as firm as it was. I mean, I would caveat that with it always helps to have cash, it always helps to have support in kind, and a mixed economy in your budget is the best way to do it if you can. But yeah, don't underpay yourselves, and if at the moment, again, if you can rationalise a little increase, I won't put a number on it, but an increase that relates to the fact that everything costs more to buy and therefore it costs more to pay yourselves. I think at the moment it's worth, don't go crazy because I don't want loads of projects getting knocked back because you've got like 15% inflation, but it's worth considering how you could articulate that to make sure that
you and everyone else is being paid properly, is able to deliver the work.
Specifically, have you heard of the Uncultured? Yeah, they're a theatre company that, because I'm going to talk about Arts Council, so please correct me if I'm wrong, I say something silly, but applying for access support funding through Arts Council is, I found, surprisingly straightforward. When you compare it, is it something you've done before as well?
So I've done it with Arts Council,
Okay.
but it's very simple. Some boxes.
Exactly. Well, the Uncultured, they have, not only do they have, they a theatre company that has a lot of resources on their website as well, but they are always throwing their services out there, looking for people to help specifically with access support. But has anybody?
I think that's something I'll have to do a bit of research on and come back to you. I'll add it onto the notes. But as I glance down my list of 30, not so much, no, but I suspect there will be some out there that do that.
I'm pretty sure, but I don't know the exact process, so forgive me, but I'm pretty sure Jerwood and Paul Hamlin at least do offer some support, but I don't know the framework of it. I don't know whether it's similar to the Arts Council or not. Yeah. So, sort of depends how you want to couch it, to be honest, because obviously it's it's not easily defined, I don't think, and there are definitely I think we would define it in the sense of if it's got an orchestra, classically trained singers, etc., then that veers more towards music. But of course, there's a bunch of opera that could easily pass as theatre as well. So I think that just depends how you want to define it in the way, like I was talking about the synopsis earlier, and maybe what the main influences are, whether or not it's primarily theatre that's influenced it, or the classical opera, for example. Sorry, that's a really bad answer, but a lot of the time, because you could use, for example, an illustrator in a theatre show, it then depends what form that show takes and how you define the art form, rather than us getting the application form and putting it into one pile or another.
In my case, it's very much kind of, rather than full sets and lots of people, it's more of a chamber opera, but it is primarily music. So it has got musicians and singers, and we're just telling the story by the songs.
I mean, instinctively, it probably feels like music, but yeah, we would, like, you could define that as different if you wanted to,
Sure.
and we would take your definition of it. Yeah. You've had a decision on your DYCP already, right?
I'm working on it at the moment, but I think I do have time to.
Yeah, you can apply. Yeah,
Okay.
you can. Yeah. So you can't have two under consideration at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the answer to that, that would be great. No. So, so basically, it's about, I think there comes a point, like for speaking about myself and Sam and Joe Klein, there comes a point where you start thinking about, kind of, as you get older, kind of this more long-term kind of vision for your company and stuff like that. So one of the things that we would like to do is to look into charity status, so we can open up to the foundations and trusts that Amin was talking about over there. Because it is really difficult. We do a lot, I'm not going to lie, we do a lot of work that's not paid, like constantly. And this year particularly, and I don't know, like to all the artists over here, it's been exhausting, and everybody who's been working and doing work or experimenting or thinking about making anything, you're an absolute legend and hero and amazing, because it's been really, really tough, and you end up working so many hours and so much time, and sometimes the reward doesn't feel as great, because we live obviously in a very kind of capitalist system that kind of judges you by how much you make, and we all know this. But so what I'm trying to say is that sometimes it is about taking a step back and reflecting on kind of the model that you want to go forward in. So, for example, what happened this year is because I was so busy, it was just this whirlwind of just doing things and just actioning, and not thinking about how that was serving you. And when I came back from Edinburgh, I had a couple of weeks off in which I started to think about how I don't want next year to look like this year, and how I can start putting things in place for that not to happen. So things like looking at charity status so that we can have core funding throughout the year is one of the things that we want to look into as one of the options. Because you end up doing a lot of work. I mean, the YCP is a really good thing as well to apply for. I've never applied for it, but that's something also I've been thinking about. In order to kind of develop myself and as an artist, etc., without having that pressure to constantly make, to constantly create, produce, some kind of factory, So I think, just looking at the model that you work in and seeing how that can work. Also, what you could do as well is plan your year and see how many projects you're gonna have in that year. Calculate all the producing fees of that year. See how much that's going to be in total, and kind of calculate it that way. Maybe if you're still working on a project to project basis, I would kind of have that planning in mind. I don't know. I spoke a lot about a lot of things, but I hope.
So I think it's breaking away from that, and then I don't know. It's that leap to being an organization.
Yeah. And another thing. Sorry. Another thing, is so you have these projects, right, which are maximum outputs, but find projects that are minimum input as well. That are maximum input. Also find your things that are, as an artist, that are minimum input. That's not gonna take you writing a whole project grant, a whole thing. So if for example you're linked to a community and giving workshops and you have an income stream from there, always look at these things, because I feel like writing a whole project grant, doing the whole thing, it takes so much. So it's important to look for those things that give you joy, but don't completely drain you as well.
Tim, did you want to?
I think Vikesh just kind of said it, but there is a growing pains point but from working as a small company or an independent artist through to a more established kind of organisation. Obviously, building multiple income streams, valuing the work you do, budgeting in some overheads and some flax, so that when you're doing something, it's not just paying its way. It's also contributing something to the sort of surplus to the bank account. When I'm kind of budgeting projects I'm obviously a lot more established than you guys, but I'm looking at kind of 50% real costs and 50% towards sort of overhead, surplus, reserve kind of thing. And obviously it takes a while to build up to that, and sometimes you have to think about how commercially viable things are that you're doing and how much revenue can be generated some things. It's going to be tricky because sometimes you're just very passionate and you should just focus on the art and make something beautiful and brilliant because that will work for you. And there are other times where I think it's what Vikesh is alluding to, you have to kind of build into your portfolio some things which you all do. I know, I'm sure, you build in the high fee paying stuff over this end to be able to kind of cover some of the stuff which is more, which doesn't have an obvious revenue boom, but it's the thing you need to do to get to that next stage of your practice or to make that next piece of work. It's always a challenge, I think, this question. Until the Arts Council actually gets properly funded by the government, it really does need more money, it's going to remain a challenge.
Yeah, and sorry, just one more thing as well. Theatre tax relief, very, very, very good. So that often fills up a lot. I feel like we got it the first time this year, like we applied for it and stuff, and I feel like it filled in some of the unpaid gaps that I had. So I felt like that was really good, and we're gonna keep doing that, like we did it this year, and like $4,000 just like jumped out of nowhere, and we were like, oh, this is great. So yeah, no, that's really, really good too.
Yeah, I think that's all really sound advice. Again, just to come at it from the funder's point of view, if you get to that point where you recognise we're stuck here, for example, you're not able to exploit opportunities that are coming your way because you just don't have the time and the people to do it, or you're offered a gig that you can't take because it clashes with something else, and actually if you had somebody who could just organise the company's time better, you'd be able to take advantage of it. That's again when you can include that in an application. You can ask for support to do business planning and strategic planning, but you need to make the case for why it's necessary at that time. As you can imagine, it's a question that almost anyone in a company asks at some point: is, well, when can we become a company? When can we be funded for a longer period? When do we not have to worry about going project to project? But if there are external forces making you ask that question of the company and the trajectory that you're on, then you might be able to make a case to do some stepping back and thinking about it and plotting what the future could look like. Unfortunately, we're not France, we don't fund artists for 30 years or whatever it is they do. And we work on electoral cycles that are entirely unhealthy for actual progression so anyway, but you can, it's an option once you've reflected on whether it's timely or not, I think.
We've got, see a hand, I just want to say we're running out of time, but we've got time for one more question.
Yeah, I mean, again, not really funding per se. DYCP that's been mentioned a couple of times, developing your creative practice, was the Arts Council's response to the fact that we were hearing from artists that they didn't have enough time in, say, lab type environment, where, like as Vikesh mentioned earlier, where you can play and explore ideas. You don't have to be connecting with audiences. The sort of thing that, and this is up for debate, sort of thing that some European countries do so much better than we do, which is just allowing people to explore their creativity and work out whether or not they're still the same artists they think they were 3 years ago. And DYCP, I think you can do up to a year's worth of activity with DYCP. And you can apply for up to £10,000. Now, of course, that's not going to keep you afloat on its own, but it's a contribution to a wider income. And crucially, it means that you can do things like have meetings, or spend time writing, or go into a rehearsal space, or have a mentor. These kind of things that support your development and support you in setting a path forward, similar to what we were just talking about with companies. It just gives you breathing space to do that. Now, again, I caveat everything I've said tonight with the fact that these funds are so competitive at the moment. They're like, really, really competitive. But that's the Arts Council's response to that question as it stands. And within that, you can hopefully use that fund, for example, to develop skills that will enable you to get other work that underpins your practice. As Vikesh was mentioning, the can't remember how you put it, brilliantly put, you only have to put 40% of yourself into it instead of 100%, and you get a much better return on that enables you to go and create stuff.
Yeah, and I just want to add as well that it's really, really important, like just as something that I wanted to say today, was that sometimes when you get like a rejection after all that work and stuff, it's just because it's so competitive right now, it's like not a reflection of you as an artist at all. Just like keep remembering that, it's really, really important. So I think I've been successful with every application I wrote for the last like 3 or 4 years, but the last one I applied for I didn't get, and I had to take like a front of house manager job for like a month to like make up for it. So that I know has no reflection on like myself as an artist and all of the work that I've done. It's just the nature of the business and the nature of the game. And I think that's why I'm in a period of kind of reflection as to what I want the following years to look like. So I think, and also because I turned 30 this year and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's just don't make it like, don't ever think that it's a reflection of you as an artist. It's just really, really competitive sometimes. And you know, some things are chosen over others, basically.
One final comment on that. I think it's okay to ask for help. You've got to build and diversify your support networks. And what you tend to find is that the older artists have more sustainable careers because they've had more time to sort of build those networks and those contacts. They're able to push up the rates because people start to trust them and they know who they're working with, and they choose to work with people that pay better rates. But essentially, to be able to do that, it's good to ask people for help. People like to help, and very often people feel cautious about asking. They feel somehow it's an embarrassing thing. And I started my career on the cold face of fundraising, on the streets, signing people up to various charities for £3 a month. And you learn that actually people like to help, they like to stop, they feel good about it. They generally walk away from those experiences thinking, yeah, I've done something good, I've helped someone, I've got involved, I've supported someone. So just when you're out there talking to people, you know, go in there and ask for them to support you or to give you the next lead, the next contact. That's okay.